they were trying to figure out what's going on in Ukraine and how so many of the people from their homes are doing whatever they can to defend their literal home, right? And to defend their city, like the capital city of Kiev. How many people are stayed behind? We know that 2.5 million have migrated to Poland and Romania and other places, but how many have stayed behind voluntarily because they're like, no, I'm fighting for my home. So they did a poll and they wanted to know how many Americans would do that. How many Americans right now admitted, what percentage admitted that they would, if that happened here and our homeland was attacked, how many would stay and fight? What do you think the numbers are? Anybody want to guess? Give me a percentage. What percentage of Americans today, if we were attacked like it's going on in Ukraine, and we're seeing the incredible response of the Ukrainian people, they're saying, no, we're staying. What percentage do you think the poll find out of Americans that would do the same? Give me a number. What do you think? Guess. Participate. What's that? 80? 40? 35?
22.
Okay, we're getting a big array. Someone said 80. Not even close. We're just talking about Bob Feller and Ted Williams right in the middle of their careers just went to
Elvis
battle.
Presley too. A lot of those guys, they just went right to the military.
Yeah. Well, and listen, I didn't take the poll, and don't shoot the messenger, no matter what your political persuasions are. But the poll found out that almost 70% of one of the political party affiliations, people said that they would stay and defend America. And the other political party, not quite 40%, said that they would. I'll leave you to figure out which political party that the people that responded said that they would stay.
Mr. Frank, have you seen the movie Red Dawn before from the 80s?
Anybody see Red Dawn?
You see Red Dawn? That's what that is. That's Americans fighting back on the Russians. The Russians invaded America.
Yeah.
It's a good classic movie.
Not everybody's actually going to stay and fight, even though they
Check
say
it out,
it
Red
now.
Dawn.
In the spur of the
Okay,
situation.
right. So if you take those numbers and say 70% or 70% of Republicans said that they would stay, how many really would when it came down to it, right? But then if you take the other number and it's in the 30s, how many really would? And then you take the opposite number, like they'll ask a series of questions. You definitely would flee to Canada. So that high, and the one party, well, let's just say it, I already just said it. The Democrats are a much higher percentage that, oh no, they'd flee. Because there's some people that are in between. Like, I'm not sure. I don't know. So, interesting. But anyway, that's why they're the greatest generation. That's why they got that nickname. So, continuing on. Mr. Schwendeman's, where's Harry Truman rank in your presidencies?
Probably top 20. Put him in the top 20. Not my top 5, though, that's for sure. You know my top 5.
I wonder who's number one.
You already know.
I
It's not who you think, though. You know that.
Is he in this room?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Wait. That's a trick question. Because
It sure is.
I always have to make the distinction, like there's George Washington and then there's all the rest of the presidents. So it's almost like when you ask who your favorite president is, to me, it's like, well, besides George Washington. Hello?
It's already a given, George Washington. Right? Is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah. All right.
You talk about the S, though. That's the most important part. What the S stands for.
I agree.
The Yalta Conference, the Potsdam Conference after World War II, that way the world was shaping up post-World War. And this is the situation Truman was entering into. I thought I was missing something. Yeah. Okay, we already did this, right? The fact that there was no VP, David, which amendment fixed the idea of presidential succession? Anybody? The 25th. Did we get all this yesterday? The last thing, big deal here, people. President Truman, Democrat, 1948. This might sound strange to some of you, growing up in the political culture that you're growing up in, and you hear things that one party's leaders are accused of something. Harry Truman, Democrat, 1948. Guess what was not popular? Desegregation. In 5th grade, you read a book called Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, right? That took place in the 1930s. It showed you that 70 years after the Civil War, which means 2 generations later, there were still a lot of people living in the South that thought the war should still be going on, right? That they did not want to give Black people equal status in their society. Well, guess what? When you get to the 1940s and the 1950s, it's the same thing. And most of the South was dominated by Democrats. Wait. Oh yeah, you haven't seen the video yet. The South's dominated by the Democrat Party in the 1940s. So today you're growing up and you're hearing let's just say what it is. Always trying to say that Trump was racist, right? Trump's a Republican president. The whole race issue, they try to frame as Republicans are racist in general, right? The 1940s, you had a low chance of getting elected if you were a Democrat, and you were talking about desegregating the military. You know what that means? Desegregating. If you think of the word segregate as a word that almost sounds like separate, segregate, separate. If you think of what that means that these men, when they were fighting in the war, they just got done with World War II. There were separate companies. So the idea after World War II was, hey, can we just make it so that it doesn't have to be a Black regiment and a white, we should all be integrated, not segregated. That had to be strongly pushed for. And Truman was kind of putting himself on the line with some of his fellow party members by continuing to promote the idea that we should desegregate. We should not be separating into races when it comes to our military. Blacks and whites are all Americans, and they should be able to fight side by side in times of combat. Imagine that you had to really fight for that. Well, you can imagine it, because some of you probably know people that still hold tightly to their very racist feelings. Truman's second term. Remember, Truman was not elected president for his first term, right? He became president shortly after FDR started his 4th term as president. So this time he's going to have a vice president. He's going to choose a very powerful senator from Kentucky named Albert Barkley. The election of 1948, Harry Truman is going to defeat the governor of New York, Thomas Dewey. The interesting thing about this election is the headlines on that early Wednesday morning from the Chicago Tribune said, Dewey defeats Truman. The most famous thing about the 1948 election is actually that headline. Someone that doesn't know much about politics and doesn't know anything about 1948 election, one thing they do know, and they will remember, if anything, was that headline, which we'll see in a video shortly, where the press, the media, had it all figured out. It was almost guaranteed Truman was going to lose. We just said in the last notes that he he had ideas that were unpopular among Democrats. Southern Democrats, especially. You may have heard of the South called Dixieland, right? So the Southern Democrats were called Dixiecrats. And there was a whole lot of blatant racism among Southern Democrats in the 1940s. In fact, these Southern Democrats were so unhappy with Truman that a group of them got together and said, we're going to have our own candidate. We're going to put up a guy named Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. And hey, it's a good thing that he has ties to the KKK. What, do you think that's a bad thing? Not to them. In the 1940s, to these Dixiecrats, his ties to the KKK, that's a plus for them. And the idea that Truman wants to desegregate the military, that's a mark against him. Again, the most famous aspect of the election was Dewey defeats Truman. They already had the stories written. So when it got to after midnight on Tuesday election day, they already had, when you get the morning paper, that thing's printed like 2:00 in the morning or whatever, depends on where you're at. And they already had the story all ready to go. They already knew Dewey was going to win. Truman was going to lose. So that was the headline. Of course, I should look into this. If someone has that newspaper today, it's probably worth a pretty good amount of money as a collector's item. Dewey defeats Truman. Here's the rundown on the election of 1948. Liberty Bibberty.
Presidential elections in American history. The 41st presidential election in American history took place on November 2nd, 1948. After Franklin Roosevelt died, Harry Truman took over, and soon after, Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allied forces. Now, all eyes were on the Pacific theater of the war. Japan was clearly suffering, but it didn't seem like they were going to surrender anytime soon. I mean, Japanese pilots were conducting suicide attacks, known as kamikaze, aimed at warships. While some historians debate whether or not the Japanese government
We didn't even
was
talk
actually
about
ready
that,
to
the
surrender in
firebombing in
summer of
Tokyo.
1945, Truman took action and decided to drop the first and only atomic bombs ever dropped on another country. He did it to end the war quickly to try to save the lives of millions of both Americans and Japanese who would have kept on fighting otherwise. While today people still debate whether or not the action was justified, it's hard to deny how bold the move was by Truman. And it worked. Japan finally surrendered shortly after Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war was over, and this time Truman made it a point to not make the same mistakes that were made after World War I. Instead of punishment, Truman called for aid. He pushed for the Marshall Plan, which had Americans give money to Western European countries to help them rebuild their economies after the war. They would also help rebuild Japan. Truman's presidency was a huge turning point for world affairs. Sure, World War II was over, but now he was all about fueling the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Truman was cold with Joseph Stalin the moment he took over, and some argue he helped start the Cold War with his strained relationship with the Soviet dictator. I get.
Remember, we said one of the big differences between FDR and Truman is FDR, when they had the Yalta Conference, was like, hey, the big three, we are all co-equals in this. We've all come together, we've defeated Nazi Germany, and now we are equal to each other. Truman went to the meeting at Potsdam, was like, no, not this Stalin guy. I don't trust this guy. I don't see Stalin as being, and Russia, Soviet Union as being equal to the United States. So this guy's commentary is that, hey, that's what started the Cold War because he's giving Stalin the cold shoulder. Well, yeah.
Yes, who could blame him? It's not like Stalin was a lovable kitty cat or anything. Truman's foreign policy objectives became famously known as the Truman Doctrine, with the main objective being always to defeat communism wherever it appeared. Truman called for aid to Turkey and Greece, where communist revolutions threatened. And he supported the Berlin airlift, basically giving the middle finger to the Soviet Union. Back home, Truman was the first president to actively call for civil rights legislation. He even desegregated the armed forces. I've read several quotes by Truman that are pretty racist, and maybe he did this just to get the black vote, but man, this was a huge step in 1948. Anyway, after all this, Truman had a very low approval rating. It seemed not nearly as many Americans liked him like they did FDR. Not only that, several people in his own political party were turning against him. They tried to get Dwight Eisenhower, the World War II hero and former Chief of Staff of the United States Army, to be the nominee instead of Truman. But they failed, as Eisenhower refused to run. Eventually, the Democrats went ahead and went with Truman as their nominee, with Alvin Barkley, the Senate Minority Leader, as his running mate. Though Truman tried to moderate his civil rights positions, some Democrats were like, nuh-uh, and walked out of the Democratic Convention. They started a new political party called the States' Rights Democratic Party. Members of this party became known as Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats wanted to keep the policy of racial segregation in the South and allow states to keep their infamous Jim Crow laws. They nominated Strom Thurmond, the governor of South Carolina and the guy who led the walkout of the Democratic Convention, for president, and Fielding Wright, the governor of Mississippi, as his running mate. Fielding Right, or like Fielding Wrong.
Wow.
Sorry, bad joke. Anyway, it wasn't just the Dixiecrats.
None of you laughed at his
Democratic
joke.
Party. Some Democrats argued that Truman's civil rights reforms didn't go far enough for blacks. They wanted more. Former Vice President Henry Wallace, who, remember, would have been president if it weren't for Truman taking his place in the 1944 election, disagreed with Truman on many issues. In fact, Truman had fired Wallace from his position as the Secretary of Commerce after Wallace talked trash about Truman's foreign policy. Wallace opposed the Truman Doctrine and wanted to get rid of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which he thought violated civil liberties. Wallace also called for more regulation against giant corporations and an expanded welfare state. Naturally, opponents called him a secret communist. Wallace and his supporters would also lead the Democratic Party to form a third progressive party called the Progressive Party. Can't we get more creative with names? Again, this was not the same progressive party as Teddy Roosevelt or Robert La Follette. It was a new one. This Progressive Party officially nominated Wallace as their nominee, with Glenn Taylor, a senator from Idaho, as his running mate. Taylor had earned a reputation as being that one weird politician in D.C., a guy known as the Singing Cowboy because he would sing songs and ride his horse up the steps of the Capitol. Not at the same time, mind you. So Wallace and Taylor were definitely unique. When they campaigned, they made a point of speaking to racially integrated audiences, even in the South. And because of that, Southerners sometimes threw food like eggs and tomatoes at them. Oh crap, I spent so much time talking about Democrats and former Democrats that I almost forgot to talk about the Republicans. Well, they tried for Dwight Eisenhower too, but after Eisenhower declined, many familiar names stood out for the nomination. Thomas Dewey, Robert Taft, Arthur Vandenberg, and Harold Stassen, who were all in the running in 1944, and some who didn't run in 1944, notably Earl Warren, the governor of California. The Republicans decided to play it safe and go once again with Thomas Dewey, who was still the governor of New York. They nominated Warren as his running mate. Dewey and Warren, as governors of two of the largest states in the country, made up a strong ticket, and with the Democratic Party fractured, nearly every poll favored them to win. Dewey made sure he did whatever he could to just avoid major mistakes. He often was vague on policy and in speeches. As I said before, Truman was not a popular president, and he even had a hard time raising money for his campaign. Shortly before Election Day, journalists were so confident that Dewey would win that they went ahead and wrote articles ahead of time proclaiming him as the next president. And here are the results. Dewey won. Just kidding. And what is considered to be the greatest election upset in American history, Harry Truman won, remaining the 43rd president in American history. No one seemed to see this one coming, and yet Truman had won by more than 2 million votes. He sure had some fun holding up this newspaper.
There it is. The most iconic scene from the 1948 election. Dewey defeats Truman. The story is already printed and sent out to the public. Whoops.
Truman received 303 electoral votes and 49.6% of the popular vote. Thomas Dewey received 189 electoral votes and 45.1% of the popular vote. As expected, Strom Thurmond did well in the South. He received 39 electoral votes and 2.4% of the popular vote. While he didn't receive any electoral votes, Henry Wallace received a solid 2.4% of the popular vote as well, getting just under 19,000 votes less than Thurmond for fourth place. Alvin Barkley became the 35th vice president in American history. The election of 1948 will forever be known as the underdog election, inspiring future candidates who were behind in the polls to think they always had a chance.
There you go. I mean, really, it's kind of amazing when his own party were running two different candidates against him, and you had the governor of California and the governor of New York on the other ticket. It's amazing that Truman was able to win. Notice that he did not get half the vote because of those other candidates. Continuing on. Questions, comments on that? Anybody? Discussion time. Bella has something she would like to discuss. No? Okay. Truman offers the American people a fair deal. FDR offered what kind of deal? No. FDR, New Deal. FDR's was the New Deal. Truman's offering a fair deal. So he presented to Congress. When does the president present to Congress his ideas? What's that called? The president calls all Congress together and he shares his ideas for his vision of the country. What do we call that? Just happened a couple weeks ago. The SOTU, the State of the Union address. Well, Congress listened, and then they said no to almost all of what Truman wanted to do. They did say yes to these things. Hey, we need to increase money for public housing. What's public housing? People that can't afford to buy a house, the government builds housing and provides housing for people. Unfortunately, over the 70, 80 years that we've provided this type of thing, oftentimes in cities, it's these housing districts, public housing districts, that become really worn down, and we start to refer to these places as slums, right? Why would it be? Why would it be more likely that public housing would become run down compared to other neighborhoods? Yeah? Okay, so the government built them and they take care of them, and Verity might be thinking that when the government runs something, it's not very efficient. They generally don't do a good job of running things. Also, who's more likely to take care of their stuff? If they actually own it themselves or not? If someone has a house and they own it, it's their investment, are they going to be more likely to take care of it, keep it maintained and looking nice, rather than someone that they don't even own it? Right? So that's a big factor in that. Oh, he also got the minimum wage raised. I wish I could tell you. I should have looked that up. What it got raised to, we'd probably start laughing when we found out what he got the minimum wage raised to. Because you'll probably start laughing if I tell you what the minimum wage was when I was your age and was able to work? What do you think it was? Anybody want to take a guess what the minimum wage was when I was Isaac's age? Right.
Like,
$3.50 an hour.
Yeah, eventually got to that. It was $2.85. I remember when it went to like $3.30 and then $3.55. Those were big increases. $2.85.
It depends on the state.
What's you pay?
And now you're living in you're living right now because of what's happened over recent years, the pandemic especially, where a lot of companies are paying more than the minimum wage because there was a shortage of people willing to work. So those of you that got jobs in the last year or so, you're the beneficiary of what happened over the last 2 years and people not being willing to work and rather stay home. And hopefully the government take care of it through the pandemic because companies had to pay more. So there was a drive the last, your whole lifetime for people to say, hey, we need to raise the minimum wage. And it goes along grudgingly. Like I said, $2.85 to $3.10 to $3.30 to $3.55 and eventually to $7 and now $8.25 maybe in Ohio. Well, hardly anybody's working for that anymore. I mean, you go to McDonald's and I see the signs, $13 an hour.
There's a restaurant, in Canton that pays that case.
Yeah. Social Security was increased. NATO, that should be all caps, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is the beginning of the Cold War, we say. So you've got two things that started after World War II. First, the United Nations. The League of Nations was replaced by the United Nations, the UN. That's going to become a very important organization that was put together to prevent another world war. As we sit here on March 15th, 2022, hoping there's not another world war. The UN, the purpose behind that is to keep nations constantly communicating with each other, sitting at the table, talking about their differences and their conflicts so it never gets to war. That's the purpose of the UN, right? And then you've got NATO. The purpose of NATO was the European countries getting caught off guard in World War I by Germany's aggression, being caught off guard again in World War II by Germany's aggression, that in the future, we need to have everybody allied. We used to have the Allies and the Axis powers and Central powers. Well, we need to make it so that and it started off with Western Europe plus America, we need to know that before anything gets out of hand again, that the rest of the world, if Germany ever decides to try to do what they did again, oh no, we're already united against you. And today you hear on the news about NATO because Ukraine is not part of NATO. Somebody might want to tell our vice president that, but Ukraine's not part of NATO, but they want to be. And Russia, Putin, knows they want to be. So he's trying to lay claim to Ukraine again, A, because he believes it's part of the motherland, part of Russia anyway. He wants to recreate the Soviet Union. Second, he does not want them to have that alliance with all of the rest of Western Europe. But the other thing is, if Putin does anything to one of the NATO countries, say Poland, where I told you yesterday over the weekend, he bombs a site 10 miles from Poland. If that happens, it's automatic that if Poland gets attacked, we're their ally, we have to do something. So if your prayers are anything beyond, just a normal, hey, I wish there was no war, Lord, make war end, and people not have to suffer, that nothing happens with countries outside of Ukraine to the west. Little addition to the notes. This has nothing to do with world peace but it is an important factor that happened in the 1940s and increased under Truman's presidency. after World War II. During World War II, as you learned in World War I, many women had to go into the workforce. They had to take the factory jobs that all the men that were off to war left. They also had to, in those factory jobs, produce the war machine, right? Well, after World War I, most of them went back to the traditional, to that time, woman being the mother caretaker of the home. Well, after World War II, many more stayed working. And we get this situation where this is a big increase. 90% means if it was 100%, it doubled. There's still most women staying in the home in the 1940s, but the percentage of women that stayed working outside the home almost doubled from 1940 to 1950. That's just a addition to your notes, something to think about as American culture changes through the years that we're going to be talking about. It's one part of the change. More moms not in the home all the time. And we'll get to the Korean War tomorrow. How could you miss that one? Right?
How many brackets have you made?
When do I have to have them done?
I haven't made any yet. I don't know.
When's the school one due?
I need to do mine for my actual.
I don't recall it, but.
I'm first again, Mr. Franklin.
I can't believe it. You are